Here is the law. He didn't do it. He is presumed innocent.
You probably recognize Dick Harpootlian from watching trials right here on Law and Crime, especially if you watched Alex Murdaugh's double murder trial and the aftermath. Harpootlian represented double murderer Alex Murdaugh during his 2023 trial for the murders of his wife Maggie and son Paul. Harpootlian's defense may not have been successful. Murdaugh, of course, was convicted of the murders and he's appealing. But the trial catapulted Harpootlian onto the national stage. Now he's written a new book, and its main character is just as fascinating as Alex Murdaugh, a real-life serial killer and rapist who terrorized the people of South Carolina for years. At least 13 confirmed victims, with the killer claiming to have murdered nearly 100 more. Dick Harpootlian dug into his past, and now we're digging into the new release, Dig Me a Grave, the inside story of the serial killer who seduced the South. I'm Angenette Levy, and this is Crime Fix. You know, there's a reason that Morgan & Morgan is America's largest personal injury law firm. It's because they fight for their clients and they win a lot in court. The firm has more than 1,000 lawyers that have recovered $25 billion from more than 500,000 clients. In the last few months, a client in Florida got $12 million when the insurance company offered just $350,000. In Pennsylvania, another client won $26 million. That was 40 times the insurer's offer. Morgan & Morgan makes it really easy to fight for what you deserve. You can even start a claim from your phone. So if you are ever injured, you can start a claim at forthepeople.com/crimefix. Click the link below or scan that QR code that you see right there on your screen. Dick Harpootlian, who's known for his work as a state lawmaker, a prosecutor, and criminal defense attorney in South Carolina, is adding a new line to his resume: published author. Harpootlian has seen a lot during his time in the justice system, and he's never shied away from cold, hard facts, no matter how gruesome. Like during his opening statement at Murdaugh's trial back in 2023, when he tried to convince the jury that there was no way in hell that Murdaugh could have killed two of his closest family members. Take a listen.
The second shot ended up, and there's going to be some question about the direction of that shot, but ended up entering his skull cavity, and the gases from that shot literally exploded his head like a watermelon hit with a sledgehammer. All that was left was the front of his face. Everything else was gone. His brain exploded out of his head, hit the ceiling in the shed, and dropped to his feet. Horrendous, horrible, butchering. So to find Alex Murdaugh guilty of murdering his son, you're going to have to accept that within an hour of having a extraordinarily bonding, you can see it in the Snapchat, that he executes him in a brutal fashion. Not believable. Not believable.
But it's a different man at the center of Harpootlian's new novel. He teamed up with investigative journalist Sean Assail to dig through hundreds of case files connected to Donald Gaskins, better known as Pee-wee. Gaskins was infamous in South Carolina in the late 70s and the years after, part of what some refer to as the state's dark underbelly of crime. A career criminal from a young age, investigators confirmed that Gaskins killed more than a dozen people, although Gaskins himself tried to insist that he killed 100 or more. Many of the confirmed victims were younger than 25, and one was just 2 years old, a little girl. Gaskins' first criminal trial was held in 1976, with the jury finding him guilty of one of the murders and sentencing him to death. But the Supreme Court vacated that sentence, instead sentencing Gaskins to life in prison. He would eventually plead guilty to 13 murders to avoid having to repeatedly go to trial. But when he killed a man on his cell block, that man was Rudolph Tyner, using explosives hidden inside a radio, it was Harpootlian who would prosecute him. And this time, Harpootlian wanted to make sure that the death penalty was going to stick. but his experience dealing with the sick serial killer changed him, and it made for a hell of a story. So I'd like to bring in Dick Harpootlian to discuss his beautifully written new book. It's entitled Dig Me a Grave, and he's written it along with Sean Assail. Dick, talk to me, if you would, about why you decided to write this book.
Well, having been a prosecutor, the district attorney here in Columbia, South Carolina, I prosecuted many, many, many murder cases, but never as a prosecutor or in the past 40 years as a defense attorney have I ever encountered anyone like Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, the largest mass murderer or serial killer in the history of South Carolina. And he was such a unique personality, and his series 14 murders, the last one being the one I convicted him of, which was assassinating a death row inmate with a quarter of a pound of C4 explosive in a blasting cap, blew his head off. He was cunning, very friendly, very just a very disarming character. And I thought for some time about, and of course I prosecuted him. He was sentenced to death and only executed. In the decade since then, I've started and stopped trying to write a book about him. And then when the pandemic came, I got serious about it. I got Sean involved, and we began writing the book and had to stop for the Murdaugh trial. What I saw during the Murdaugh trial and after the Murdaugh trial was this huge community of true crime aficionados, people that were hooked on true crime. And so when I came out of that, we decided to finish the book because we thought there'd be a market for it, and people would be interested in this story because it's so unique and so, on one level, gruesome, on the other, philosophical, sort of wrestling with the death penalty. So that's how it came about, and that's what motivated it. I thought it was a story that people would like to hear and see and read about, and I think we're right about that.
I think you're right too, because this Pee Wee Gaskins guy, I mean, he is horrific. I mean, he's a horrific character. And what really stuns me about him is that had he maybe been wired a little differently, or maybe if he hadn't, you write about how he like drank that turpentine and then he was just never right again. I mean, he was born to like a very young mother. Who knows if it's nature versus nurture? I just have no idea. But if he had put all of his smarts and his intelligence that he had, and like he was able to fix anything, he was not a dumb guy.
Right.
But if he had directed that in a positive way, he could have been a very positive force in life. Instead, he made choices to kill people, and he committed horrific crimes, including murdering that poor little 2-year-old girl after killing her mother.
Right.
I mean, this guy was a monster. And so...
Well, I mean, on one hand, look, I've read about all the previous murders. I watched what he did on the murder we convicted him of, and I had the opportunity to talk to him from time to time. His personality, sort of a affable, hail fellow, well met kind of guy. The first time I saw him was in a bond hearing in October of 1982. And as he walked into the courtroom, his hands shackled and feet with shackles also, sort of shuffled in, he looked over at me and said, "Hi, Dick." And of course, my reflection, we said, "Hey, Pee Wee, how you doing?" And from that point forward, it was Dick and Pee Wee when we were not in front of a jury. And I think in the book I recount sitting there at lunch during the trial. And again, he was such a persuasive con man. He convinced the guards to let him eat his lunch in the courtroom rather than down in the holding cell. And I'm sitting there scribbling away, working on getting ready for the witness in the afternoon. And I hear Pee Wee in that high-pitched voice, and I remember it as if it were yesterday. "Dick, Dick." I said, "What do you want, Pee Wee?" He said, "You're a lot like me." And I said, I sort of looked over at him, recoiled, and I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You like killing. Like me, you like killing." I said, no, that's ridiculous. He said, "Well, you look like you really like killing me? You're enjoying it?" And I said, "No, no, I'm here to do justice." And he said, "Oh no, you're enjoying this too much." And your view of justice, where I've been in prison most of my life, your view of justice depends on whether you're giving it or getting it. Sort of a sexual innuendo there. And he just cackled. I mean, this is a guy on trial for his life, and he's trying to get in my head about the death penalty and about me being a killer like him. So, and that wasn't the only encounter I had with him, as detailed in the book. And I just think he was such a unique, and I really never bore him any personal ill will, even though he did beat a 2-year-old to death with a hammer and drown her mother, and stabbed, shot, poisoned, blew up 14 people. All the while driving around his community over in Florence and Sumter, what we call the PD part of South Carolina, and his vehicle of choice, a hearse. This guy many times had bodies in the back of that hearse, and people were just yucking it up about, "Oh, Pee Wee, look at him, he's driving that purple hearse around," and he had a siren on it, and he'd get kids and ride them around and blow the siren and entertain them. I mean, he was unique. He sort of and of course married 6 times, never divorced, and several of them were when I say underage, one was 14. So he had an obsession with young girls. He killed people. He's not a Bundy or a Jeffrey Dahmer with this pattern of certain kinds of people he wanted to kill. His response to what he thought broke the social mores, like the pregnant woman was pregnant by a white woman, pregnant by a black man. The child was half black, half white, and he just thought that violated the code of his code of conduct, of racial segregation, and they are better off dead than alive. He had people that did drugs or sold drugs that which he didn't do drugs, hated drugs. He poisoned a woman who had been selling drugs, put battery acid in her Coca-Cola. So he's a complicated guy, smart guy, cunning guy, and got away with murder for 5 or 6 years, murder after murder after murder. So you're right, he could have been something else, but he was probably sexually abused as a small child. We know when he went to reform school, the Florence School, industrial school for white boys in the 40s, there were no, it was obviously segregated back then. One big dorm, he was the smallest guy there, obviously sexually assaulted numerous times. He escaped 8 times. The superintendent, I think this is telling, in 1945, I believe, wrote, after he escaped the last time they were sending him to the mental hospital to be evaluated, said, clearly this young man has homicidal tendencies and will in the future kill somebody. I mean, they could see it back then when he was 14 years old. So
Yeah, some things just don't change, right? I mean, human beings are human beings. They could spot it back then.
Right. Even back then, right? I mean, they could see it coming. So I thought he was a fascinating character. I thought it was a fascinating case, and I think the book. I'm very proud of this book. It comes out next Tuesday, the 16th, and I'll be all over the state and all over the country signing books and trying to promote it. I think it's worth a read. I think it's based on the pre-orders. I think a lot of people want to read it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably do want to read it, because this is like somebody that I think that a lot of people aren't aware of. And he is somebody who is, I mean, all of these serial killers are incredibly terrifying, but this is somebody, if you are interested in this subject matter, it's not somebody that a lot of people have heard of. So you kind of are one of the first people to really tell this story, and you had a front row seat to it because you were so intimately involved in the case. I want you to talk to me a little bit about, pursuing the death penalty against this guy, even though you were morally opposed to it. But you said, look, I took an oath. I swore to uphold the law. And this was the law at the time. And I was the prosecutor.
Well, and I talk about this in the book. My dad was a B-17 pilot during World War II from England He went on the first 2 Berlin raids, horrific losses. And while I was a prosecutor and doing death penalty cases, we had this discussion about, my dad was the most gentle, not pacifist, but certainly wasn't somebody that would relish killing anybody. And yet, when I talked to him about that first Berlin raid, I said, y'all got shot up real bad, and what was the military target that in Berlin that was so important? He said, I said, what'd you bomb in Berlin? He said, Berlin. He said, the Germans were bombing the Blitzkrieg of 1943. They bombed London every night. V2s coming in. They were trying to demoralize the population. Their role was to bomb Berlin and make the Germans pull their fighter defenses back from the Channel to defend Germany, which would give the opportunity for D-Day. So I said, well, you just bombed Berlin, you killed women and children and civilians. He said it was an act of self-defense. You will kill when it's an act of self-defense. The most pacifistic person will do that if it's them or us. And so I always looked at, after that discussion, I always looked at the death penalty as an act of self-defense. And that's why Gaskins, who had been convicted and sentenced to death in the late 70s, had those sentences reversed after the Furman versus Georgia decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, and then allowed to plead guilty to life sentences. He's given that break. He's eligible for parole. There was no life without parole back then, and yet he undertakes this effort to kill a guy on death row, and not for money. But I mean, I think he did it. The guy on death row was a black guy who killed 2 white folks, a couple, during an armed robbery. It was the son of those 2 folks that got Gaskins to do it. I think he did it for the challenge, and it satisfied some racial animus he had. So and I point this out. I'm convinced even more today than even back then that the death penalty was appropriate for Gaskins. 2 weeks before he was to be executed, he tried to get his son to kidnap my 4-year-old daughter and hold her hostage in exchange for me getting him brought up to the courthouse from where he thought he could escape. And the son in his statement said, when he asked his father what he should do if I wouldn't do that, and he said, kill her. He was telling his son to kill a 4-year-old girl, my daughter, am I, do I have any remorse over him being put in the electric chair and basically burned to death? No. But at the same time, I don't relish it. I think that's the important thing. have always been concerned about prosecutors with a little gallows on their desk, or go. I didn't go watch. Could have watched Gaskins executed. Why would I do that? I don't like killing people. Why would I want to watch that? I have no idea why any prosecutor who's supposed to be a professional would want to go watch somebody executed. Is there some satisfaction? If you get satisfaction from that, you're no better than they are.
Well, Dick, I agree with you on that point. The book is fascinating, and I hope so many people will check it out. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Again, this was a labor, not of love, but certainly one that I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed writing it. I loved working with Sean. And I think we've got a book that's very readable and should be entertaining, maybe not the right word, but fascinating.
Indeed. Dig Me a Grave is on sale now. You can find it wherever most books are sold. And that's it for this episode of Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. Thanks so much for being with me. I'll see you back here next time.